Ki te whakamoemiti ki te atua, mō ngā manaakitanga me ngā āwhina ki a mātou. Te tangata whenua. Nei tua huhu riri. Nā rangatira o ngā tai hua riri. Tēnā koutou. Me ngā rangatira o ngā tai nai tahu. Tēnā koutou. Mihi nui ki a koutou. Nā rangatira mā. Nā whānau āwhina mā. Tēnā koutou, mihi aroha ki a koutou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. E whaatolo whaatu I le pāia, lasi ua whātasi mai. Greetings to everyone. I want to try and share quite a bit of history, and sometimes people feel resistant to history because there's so much emphasis upon the now in modernism. But there's this whakatoki, ka mua ka muri, walking backwards into the future, which talks to us about the significant achievements of the past and learning from those achievements. Housing policy in New Zealand was the envy of many other countries in the post-war years. And then we gave it all away, as Kay Saville-Smith has already referred to. And there are lessons to be learned in what we achieved, how we lost it, and what we need to be getting back again. Okay, so I just want to provide a context after the Second World War. So there was the Depression and the Second World War that many of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, depending which age cohort you're in, experienced. These were tough years for people. And Labour and national governments were committed to a policy of full employment through the 1950s and 1980s, right through to the 1980s. There was strict control in the economy, large public service, strong protectionist manufacturing policies so that everyone could be employed. We were a unique country in that we had actually the 6th highest living standard in the world right through to the early 1970s. And it was, we had an industrial income off an agricultural base because Britain took all so many of our exports. There was a large post-war labour force that was required, and this led to a rural to urban migration of many Māori households to the cities and out of tribal areas, and for the Pacific people coming from the islands into the urban centres in New Zealand. They all needed housing, and it became a national priority. So in 1936, post-Depression, Labour's primary focus was on a massive state housing program, which they began to build. But at the same time, they reconstituted the State Advances Corporation, and it was empowered to provide low-interest loans, so that they lowered the interest rates and they extended the loan period from the state to beyond 2/3 of the total mortgage. However, it was actually the national government, the first national government, the old United Reform Coalition had sort of imploded, the one that lost to Michael Joseph Savage in 1935, and a new national party had been formed. And while they did a number of things that you might consider anti-socialist, they certainly stepped up home ownership in a big way. Sidney Holland, in a massive housing program, Sidney Holland stated, he was the Prime Minister, "In the past there's been a tendency for the government to provide people with rented homes. We intend to change that," and the construction was expanded nationwide. So here's a few pickies of what happened. The National Party considered the Labour Party was very socialist, so they started this socialist propaganda saying that Labour would take your house. Well, it worked for them. They won the election. And then these were the sort of brochures that they put out, nice middle-class looking white families who could purchase their own homes. But in actual fact, as you'll find, even beneficiaries were able to afford mortgages, as I'll come to a bit later on. The role of the state as a house builder and mortgage provider became an unquestioned priority for both national and Labour governments. And I'm going to take you through a number of dates and post-war policy changes that illustrate just how committed both National and Labour were to investing in home ownership. Oh, I'm getting a message on the screen, yeah. They were doing it, albeit for economic purposes. But what they did was provide a lot of access to home ownership. Please don't feel you've got to remember these dates or these things. I'm only taking you through them just to show how many changes there were, how much the governments outcompeted each other, National and Labour, over the period right through to the mid-1980s in providing home ownership. So, in 1951, state tenants were able to purchase their own houses. Now, there was a discriminatory aspect to this. Māori were excluded from this until 1961. However, there were rental houses and home ownership houses provided through the Department of Māori Affairs. Later on, of course, after 61, Māori had access to both. The package for a subsidised loan was 5% deposit and an interest rate of 4.75% over 40 years. In 1957, there was the lay-by savings accounts were introduced. And if you purchased a house, the interest rate was 3%, and you got given £5 for every £100, up to a maximum of £100. I'll show you the actual house price costs a bit later on in a chart, but that was a considerable help. And then the Labour government came in. This is the National Labour government, the second Labour government, and they put the whole thing on steroids. They reduced the 4.7 interest rates to 3%, to lower the chance of mortgage stress and to further incentivise home ownership. In the same year, they increased the universal family benefit by 25%, and then they passed the Family Benefits Home Ownership Act 1958, enabling the family benefit to be capitalised for the purchase of a first home up to a cap of £1,000. Between 1951 and 1966, home ownership increased from 61% in New Zealand to 69%. In 1972, the limit of family benefit capitalisation was increased. By this time, decimal currency had occurred, so the £1,000 had become $2,000. The £1,000 had become $2,000, and it was lifted to $3,000. This was done under a national government. Then we began to get into economic difficulties, New Zealand. And what is really interesting is how they kept the policies flowing to protect home ownership subsidies. So just to show you how serious things were, Britain joined the European Economic Community, which is now we call the EU. And they had a common agricultural policy that significantly reduced New Zealand's exports and primary products. For example, prior to 1973, 90% of butter exports went to Britain and 75% of cheese exports went directly to Britain. It was a colonial economy. These reduced the butter from 90% to 17%, and from 75% for cheese to 68%. 2 years later, these quotas were halved, and then they were effectively reduced as time went on. In 1973, there was also the first of the major oil shocks that impacted harshly on the New Zealand economy. This was as a result of the Yom Kippur War between Arab nations and Israel, and the price of the barrel of oil rose from £3 to £20. New Zealand was, of course, very dependent for its exports upon oil and, of course, its internal transport. In 1974, the State Advances Corporation was reformed to become the Housing Corporation of New Zealand. And in 1974, a home savings accounts were introduced. These enabled a purchase grant. This was a straight purchase grant. of up to 25% of people's savings that they'd put towards a house. It was an incentive. If you could get 25% of money you'd set aside for a house up to $1,312.50. In 1974, the Home Ownership Act 1974 provided an interest rate subsidy in relation to savings for a house purchase. It's a very complicated formula, which I can't go into now just because of time, but it was a further subsidy. And then in 1976, by which time the national government was back in again, they took that and capitalised it over 5 years. So that's really interesting that capitalisation of the family benefit, when people talk about it today, they say you can't do it today because we don't have a universal benefit. But they took a savings option and capitalised it for a period of 5 years, which was very interesting. And then in 1978, the cap on the savings account was increased, was almost doubled to $2,562. Then a second major oil shock impacted on the New Zealand economy, and barrel prices went from US $13 up to $32 a barrel. In 1980, New Zealand had dropped from being the sixth most wealthy country per capita in 1965 to 19th in 1980, which is about where we still are now. In 1981, the first home mortgage rebate scheme was introduced, which provided $1,000 over 5 years, which was effectively an extra $5,000 subsidy per household. In 1982, the limit of the family benefit capitalisation was increased from $3,000 to $4,000. Now, what I've gone through that list for is not for you to remember any particular one of those, but just to show that both National and Labour were sort of out-competing each other in trying to provide security for people. Careful layers of post-war assistance culminated in 1991 with the peak of home ownership, and I'll show you those figures shortly in a second. But here's 3 really interesting bullet points. A 1991 Housing Corporations, this is an official government survey, found that 42% of the corporation's borrowers were beneficiaries. Now, I must say there were a lot of beneficiaries in 1991 because we had very high unemployment by that stage. But it just shows you that this access to home ownership went right down to the lowest incomes. 30% were households headed by women, and during the 1980s, 86% of finance for Māori mortgages came from the state. Then the fourth Labour government, this is the Longy-Douglas government, passed the Family Benefit Home Ownership Act 1986 and the Home Ownership Savings Act 1986, Savings Amendment Act 1986, which prevented any new applications to both of these subsidies. They were stopped overnight, literally, in the budget. So what I want to do is just show you a summary of that in this chart, and I'll just take you through it. This is a chart we developed, having done a lot of research for this Waitangi Tribunal report that Jade referred to. If you have a look at the family benefit capitalisations, now you notice I've skipped years in order to fit it into the slide, so if you just keep an eye on the year and on the left-hand side. In the second column, you can see the access to ownership money that you had through the capitalisation of the family benefit progressively over the years. The next is the average, the third column is the average house price in New Zealand at that time. So it moves from pounds, and when the pounds aren't there, it actually turns into dollars. And then the government contribution of the family benefit is the next one. So the capitalisation of the family benefit was worth 30% or more in the early days. But you can see it reduced right down, and by 1986 it was only worth about 5% of the cost of a house. And when the Longy-Douglas government came in 1984, it was worth about 7%. So they added in these other various things from 1973 onwards, when that economic shock occurred. So you can see the Home Services Purchase Grant, you can see the annual tax rebate, the $1,000 each year that added up to $5,000. We couldn't, it's not recorded how much the home savings interest subsidies were across the board because they varied so much from family to family. But there was one year when the ANZ Bank advertised it and they set out the formula. So that year, 1982, it was worth about $2,782. Then there was the lay-by account. And what you can see on the far side is, if you take it right down to 1984, when in the far column on the right, when the Longy-Douglas government came in, the state was still providing 20%, more than 20% of the cost of the house in some form of direct investment to households. Okay, so what you see here is the proportion of people living in owner-occupied dwellings, so the normal way we measure home ownership. And you can see in 1991 was the highlight. So the total population was 75.2%, you can see in the right-hand column. But for Māori, it was 57.4%. It was 18% less than the total population. But in 1986, it was 21% less. So what had happened is that the beginning of the closing of the gap had begun to occur. That Māori were beginning to get access, and it was closing the gap. It needed, another decade or so to catch up. But then, of course, the policies of the 1990s, which I'm just about to go into, you see everybody starts reducing. And you see Māori home ownership go down from 57 to 52 to 47 to 45 to 43, and it sort of leveled off again in the 2018 census at 47. Okay, so what happened in the 1990s? There was a change of discourse, and the neoliberal economic reforms of the fourth Labour government provided the platform for the housing reforms to take place. So what happened was that basically Roger Douglas led the reforms in the economic sphere. It had social implications because he traded off inflation to lower inflation. He created mass unemployment. But it was basically, he worked in the economic sphere. It was when the national government came in 1990 that these reforms went deeply into the social areas like housing and benefits. So the language of housing policy from the 1950s to the 1980s centred around a view that while most households can succeed in the market, it is an imperfect object, and the role of government in housing is to cater for those who are less successful by assisting them to meet their housing needs. I think that's a pretty familiar way of looking at it today amongst a group here. However, the new discourse in the 1990s, by contrast, elevated the market to the provider of choice that should not be impeded by interventions of government that might suppress it. Instead of the government insisting with housing products like state houses for life and subsidised loans that made purchasing a house affordable for those on low and modest incomes, a housing voucher was provided in the form of the accommodation supplement. So they could move all the state house rents up to a market level. People were already paying a market level in the private rental sector, and they removed all the subsidies from those wanting to purchase their own house. And the accommodation supplement was their contribution, as they put it, to the social side. Oh. Okay, so from their point of view, and I'm speaking from their point of view at this point, this was seen to be fairer because it was considered to enable a rational choice across state and private rental as well as home ownership. There was a belief in a market principle that the demand for low-cost housing would lead to an adequate supply of affordable housing. The changes were expected to free people from dependence on the state, which was seen as bad, and to facilitate market rationality, which was seen as good. The Housing Corporation was placed on a much more commercial footing. The Housing Restructuring Act in 1992 legislation, it was required to be, quote, and this is in the Act, as profitable and efficient as comparable businesses that are not owned by the Crown. The accommodation supplement alone would provide the social element. So, state houses were moved to market rents, and the subsidies on mortgage were removed over a period of years, and the state-owned mortgages were sold off to private banks. I'll show you more about that shortly. This occurred during a period of record high unemployment and what was called the mother of all budgets that Ruth Richardson led, that substantially reduced beneficiary incomes. Okay, so this is just to show you the way Douglas had traded off inflation for unemployment. If you have a look at the far right column, unemployed Māori, you can see how Māori unemployment reached its peak in 1991 and 92 of a quarter of their population. For all New Zealanders, it was 10.6. That's all New Zealanders, including Māori. It was 10.6. So it was 2.5 times worse for Māori. But you can see in that second column, inflation came down. And when it came down to its lowest amounts, unemployment was at its highest. And that was the price they were prepared to pay. There was no account of the human cost of this. So I thought I'd lighten things with one of the cartoons of the period, Garrick Tremaine showing his view of what had happened to the welfare state. Then they stole off the Housing Corporation mortgages for $2.4 billion. This was not put back into housing. This just went into the general pot. And they were sold to banks, but also to the Mortgage Corporation. The Mortgage Corporation was an outfit that Faye Richwhite put together to make a fast buck off housing. And you can see that they appear in a lot of those rather large tranches that came through. However, they got into trouble in the end and had to sell them at a loss, which was unfortunate for them, of course. $2.4 billion is what all those mortgages were sold for. And here's the consequence for Māori. Prior to this, the state, through the Department of Māori Affairs and the Housing Corporation, funded 86% of Māori mortgages, while 53% of European Pākehā mortgages gained their, 53% of European Pākehās gained their first mortgage lending from private institutions. So Māori were much more dependent upon the state for their mortgages. So what happened in terms of the government's investment was much impacted far more on Māori than the rest of the population. The 1980s witnessed a sustained growth in Māori home ownership, growing 12 percentage points which was more than 1% a year. In fact, if you take the amount of mortgages they had in 1981, the amount of home ownership in 1981 census, it increased 27% by 1991. It's a phenomenal amount. However, they reached this figure of 57.4, but the gap was decreasing. It was 18% different, but it had decreased from 21%, and it was on a trajectory to go on decreasing. Tragically, catch-up had started to take place, but the changes impacted much more on them. Māori home ownership reduced 18% between 1991 and 2001, and 25% between 1991 and 2013. For the total population, that drop was 10%. So again, Māori 2.5 times more affected. Over the course of the 1990s, the government sold all the state mortgages and received the sale price of $2.4 billion. If we take a conservative third of the value as the minimum that one could expect the Māori mortgages were worth, it sums to about $804 million. This is some of the work I did for this report. The treaty settlements over the same period, the 1990s, involved the commercial fisheries and Waikato Tainui and Ngāi Tahuiwi. They were 70 million each. 170 million each. Together, these added to 510 million, a total considerably less than the value of the Māori mortgages alone that the state sold to banks and the Mortgage Corporation. One of the issues I raise in the report is that while some very progressive treaty arrangements were taking place on the one hand. On the other hand, fundamental stability in the whānau whare was being removed. 86% of Māori homeowners had entered into subsidised mortgage contracts with the state in good faith. It is highly unlikely that they or their European counterparts thought that the state would sell their mortgages to the private sector. Their good faith was in an affordable mortgage that they would be able to pay off over the course of their working life, like other New Zealanders at the time. It was a breach of faith. Then, of course, there was the Pacific people. And here's an example. They were affected, percentage-wise, even more. Their home ownership figures fell 38%. I was very glad to hear Andrew Crisp today talk about the need to focus on Pacific home ownership. This is really essential. And while there was some very important housing investment in the budget, there wasn't anything there special for the Pacific population. So their drop was 38%. If you take all the privatisation, we got this figure. If you take all the privatisations, they came to 19 billion. And the second biggest sell-off, as you can see, was the Housing Corporation mortgages. It was hardly raised in the media, in newspapers or television. There was much more about the Post Office Bank and Air New Zealand, which you can see were much less. There were further impacts of the reforms. By 2000, the child poverty statistics grew over a fifth of all children to over a third of all children after housing costs were taken into account. So in the poverty measurement that we use, both in the Child Poverty Reduction Act and that MSD uses in their household incomes that they report on annually, they use a measure that we developed at the Family Centre along with some economists at Victoria University in the New Zealand Poverty Measurement Project. And we particularly got measures before housing costs and after housing cost. After housing costs, child poverty jumps, if you measure it that way, from a quarter to a fifth. Most of the mortgage interest subsidies prior to the 90s had been for new builds. Now again, this is Kay Saville Smith's work, had been for new builds. And this had kept the supply of low-cost houses growing. So the subsidies were you had to have a new build. And so it kept the supply of low-cost housing going. An unfortunate consequence of the reforms was the reduction in the supply of low-cost housing, which in turn increased unaffordability because of the lack of supply. From 1960 to 1986, the state invested in home ownership grants and interest rate subsidies seldom dropped below 1.5 billion annually. And on occasions, it went over 2 billion. So that was from 1960 to 1986. This is a figure you really want to remember. When the investment was reduced to a trickle in 1993, the lower quartile value, that's the lowest 25% of house prices, the lower quartile value had 25% of them were new builds. By 2012, those new builds, the percentage of new builds had reduced from 25% to 5%, whereas the upper quartile value, the upper 25% of costs, had increased to 50%. Builders obviously made much more with the two-bedroom, four-bedroom at least, two-bathroom type buildings. So, I just want to finish this part about the impact of the reforms with this slide. No, sorry, I've done that slide. Here we go. So I'm going to move on to home ownership. So what's important is when we get all this data, what is home ownership about? I mean, what is actually being lost here? So the majority of studies on the relationship between housing and tenure and health demonstrate significant health promoting effects of home ownership over renting. both physical and mental health. These are international studies as well as New Zealand studies. A minority of studies show no statistical significant effects. No studies were found that showed significant negative relationships between home ownership and physical or mental health. Likewise, in education, educational achievement has been associated with home ownership in a range of international studies. The research shows that home ownership benefits children rather than adults in the household, with greater academic success. While not all studies agree on the extent of the positive outcomes of tenure in this regard, most of the literature points towards positive educational achievement as a result of home ownership tenure. A smaller number of studies found no significant evidence of an independent effect of home ownership tenure on educational outcomes, but no studies were found that demonstrated negative effects. So I'm just summarising just a whole lot of literature here because there isn't time to go into it. Internationally, home ownership is consistently associated in research studies with better physical and mental health. It usually enables higher employment rates and faster exits out of unemployment when it occurs. Studies have found home ownership associated with lower crime rates. The children of homeowners tend to show significantly higher educational attainment levels than those of renters in the majority of educational studies. They are less likely to incur welfare costs. And these outcomes, it's really important to note statistically, that are not the results of simple higher income households being more likely to choose ownership over renting, because many of these studies, the most of them, actually control statistically for socioeconomic status, income difference, and levels of parental education. So there is a need to take home ownership much more seriously than we have in housing policy. Economic equality is not simply measured by income. OECD in most countries measures income and wealth when they look at equality. Owning or part-owning a house is one of the only ways low and modest income households can build wealth like most in most like countries to ours. People who own their own home have more options owing to the asset they are gradually building. If there are turbulent economic times or need for unexpected income, owners can restructure their mortgage or extend smaller payments over a longer period. They can pay interest only on their loan, or they can enter into a temporary mortgage holiday. They can also use the asset to borrow for starting a business or helping another family member. You may or may not be aware that intergenerational wealth, as measured by Consumer New Zealand quite recently, has found that the bank of mum and dad has become the fifth biggest lender. This is talking about intergenerational equity. Has become the fifth biggest lender after ANZ, Westpac, BNZ, and ASB when it comes to helping adult children financially into buying their own homes. New Zealand parents are dishing out more than $22 billion in loans to adult children, largely helping with deposits on the loan. Statistics New Zealand longitudinal study, this is the SOFI survey of family incomes and employment, showed, it's a longitudinal study that went for 10 years, shows that Māori net worth at the beginning of the period in 2003 was half that of the total population, and 46% of that of the European Pākehā population. 8 years later, those figures had declined to 40.8, equivalent to 41%, and 35.6, respectively. There is a huge loss of wealth that's gone on in the Māori community that we should be aware of if we're serious about housing. I hardly ever hear housing providers or advocates talk about these issues. Why should low and modest income households be denied a share in the asset building? The injustice of the growing inequity, in my view, is shameful. In the long term, homeowners can expect a better overall quality of life because they share both the wealth and the income generated in Aotearoa. Much of their housing cost actually builds their wealth, whereas rental costs build the wealth of landlords. I just don't understand how policy has not recaptured that in better economic times. We certainly understood it in the post-war years. Homeowners have greater control of their housing circumstances, unlike a renter who is often subject to a landlord's decisions. Owners are better able to chart their own course and transfer accumulated wealth to the next generation to contribute to housing stability for them. The significance of home ownership is frequently underestimated. It tends to dip below the radar consciously, the radar of public consciousness, probably because it is those that are poorer, at the poorer end of the income continuum, who have the most difficulty assessing it. Home ownership offers more than just the tangible benefits of accommodation, security and opportunity. It provides dignity, independence, and rangatiratanga. The years after 1990 to 2014, not a lot happens. The fifth major government removed the profit focus from housing through the Housing Restructuring Amendment Act and restored the social housing objectives. They invested heavily in housing policy through a large-scale state house program to replace houses sold by the previous national government and the restoration of income-related rents on state houses. However, the topic of this address, home ownership, was not a primary focus. The fifth national government invested even less. I thought you might enjoy this. Oh. Yeah. So this is Marie Antoinette. You know, she was the wife of Louis XVI of France. They both were guillotined in the end during the French Revolution. But her famous saying, which apparently she probably never said, but it's always accorded to her, "Let them eat cake." So it has John Key, people coming saying, "The peasants want to be able to afford a house, Majesty. Let them buy an apartment." So the changes, some good changes, some really worthwhile changes, have begun to occur. So I've called these the new shoots of Harakeke, 2014 to 2021. In 2014, a report, a really important report, Hei Whare Ahuru Hei Oranga Tangata, the Māori Housing Strategy, Directions 2014 to 2025. It was initiated by a collective of Māori housing advocates, including the newly formed Te Matapihi, Hapu Iwi ministerial supporters, and particularly Minister Tariana Turia, who was in a coalition with National at that time, and various housing providers. It began a process that is continuing to transform housing today. Jade, who introduced me, has written this up. It's really worth going into some of her articles. She does lots of blogs, and they're really interesting, and she drew attention to this. A strategy which integrated a Māori-specific set of values. This is what the report is about. It's a strategy, the first one really, that integrated a Māori set of values and leveraged existing programs such as investment in social housing and had considerable ambition, including in home ownership. Quote, one of its goals being that home ownership for Māori households equals national averages by 2040. Wouldn't that be something to achieve? Except would be good if we could get it a little earlier than that. In 2010, Te Matapihi, Hei Turahanga Mō Te Iwi Trust was established, as we heard from Tyrone earlier today, or was it yesterday? I'm sort of losing time at the conference. And of course, we miss Wayne not being here, who's been so much a presence in CHAR. Then it was registered in 2011 and was launched in 2012 at the National Māori Housing Conference. It is a very significant body and has been very significant to policy changes. It was informed about housing, and particularly Māori housing, and they've been able to liaise with iwi and Māori organisations, provide an informed, independent Māori voice for the Māori housing sector, advocate, build capacity, link Māori organisations with one another, and negotiate with strength in local and national political forums. Just before we get on to the good stuff that is to do with Mahi Ka Ora, let me just cover a couple of things that you will be aware of, and I just want to deal with them really quickly. Kiwi Build was proved to be a bit of a disaster. And when you look at the actual houses that were built, Television One in June last year, through an Official Information Act request, was able to show that Māori, the building for Māori out of Kiwi Build was 4.3%. It wasn't anything that you could say was addressing the housing crisis that we've got. And if you look at progressive home ownership, which is an important policy, and many people here are involved in it, it has, in the latest dashboard on the HUD's website, 335 households have been supported into home ownership through the Progressive Home Ownership Fund. This is since its inception in 2019. 33 of these were Māori, which represents 10% of the total households. While any of these houses is an achievement for the whānau concerned, the program is hardly impacting on the Māori, on the crisis for Māori whānau, and it really lacks scale. Now, I'm not wanting to put down progressive home ownership. It is a very important program, but it really needs to gain ambition and become less bureaucratised and enable and facilitate much more scale. So the example for that is what I'm about to talk about now, and this is where we've got to, and it's very exciting. Mahi Kaora, the National Māori Housing Strategy. It elevates the Māori and iwi housing innovation Mahi framework for action, which Tyrone's talked about, providing strategic direction that puts Māori at the heart of Aotearoa, New Zealand's housing system. That is on the HUD website. They have embraced that, as Andrew said today. Te Mahi Kaora was initiated with a range of partners, including Te Puni Kokiri, the support of the National Iwi Chairs Forum, some hapu and iwi, Te Matapihi, of course, and it was developed through Mahi Whare Wānanga, and Tyrone talked about those and how important they were. The first meeting with HUD officials was with the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, and following her appointment as Associate Housing Minister. Now, because Tyrone's talked about it, I'm going to short-circuit a bit of this, but I just want to get some of the really important things, because this is quite amazing. It shouldn't be amazing, but it is amazing that a government department has adopted this. Mahi Kaora is unambiguous as to what needs to be changed, and invites those who want to make a difference for Māori housing and wellbeing to engage with Te Ao Māori. They accept nothing less. It refers to a whole system approach which will respond, review and reset, and Tyrone talked about that, so I won't go into that. But basically, what you can see here in this little diagram, which I've taken from the description on the HUD website, Mahi drives a whole system approach. It sets an expectation of cohesion across government agencies to accelerate Māori housing and wellbeing. It states clearly that for the government housing program to deliver successful housing outcomes for Māori, it must, 1, partner with Māori, 2, apply kaupapa Māori approaches, 3, take the necessary system approaches. Now that's a big commitment for a government. It shouldn't be. It should be axiomatic since the signing of the treaty, but it hasn't been. And so it's quite historic, I think. The document is comprehensive, exploring almost all aspects. I really commend the document to you, Mahi Kaora, of housing across 6 key priority areas. Māori Crown partnerships, well, you can see the list that's there. Each has a page near the end of the document that includes respond, review and reset actions with pathways, deliverables and timeframes attached to them. This is very smart, these negotiators, and there's no way a government can move out of it without having a lot of egg on their face. Te Mahi Kaora, the National Housing Strategy, was released in September 21, and significantly, as Andrew said today, in conjunction with the government policy statement on housing and urban development. The government policy statement is the commitment for the next 20, 30 years, the policy commitment for the next 20 to 30 years. And it was signed, as I recall, by, I think, Grant Robertson and Megan Woods, the commitment to that. There, sorry, I should have shown that side. This is the diagram. You won't be able to see a lot of the stuff, but in the, is it your left hand? The left-hand corner down the bottom is the most exciting part, which I want to sort of finish off on. Whai Kāinga, Whai Oranga. This is a 730 million that was committed out of budget 2021. 350 of which was for infrastructure, and we've heard a lot about the need for infrastructure in a lot of Māori housing because councils and stuff stopped when it came to Māori land, and so there aren't the pipes, there aren't the electricity, and there were so many rules against them. So it's critical that there's infrastructure there, and 380 to build housing. So in March 2021, Minister Woods announced a 3.8 billion housing acceleration fund to increase the pace, scale, diversity and affordability of new housings. It was to unlock land and provide infrastructure and deliver houses. In May 2021, in the May 2021 budget, the Māori investment package was announced. And this was the new funding that I've just talked about, the 730 million. And this is what it set out to achieve. 1,000 builds, new builds, repairs to 700 housing. You can see the other numbers that. The commitment to 1,000 has already, I was talking to Kararaina, and they've already gone over 1,000 in terms of the commitments. They just got hold of that fund and used it immediately. The fund focuses on sustainability, increasing Māori-led regional housing over the medium to long term. The 5 regions are Te Taitokoro, Tairāwhiti, Heratonga, Hastings, Napier, Taranaki, including central and includes Central North Island Bay of Plenty region, including Rotorua. So I just want to talk about the significance of this. This type of investment, both in terms of processes of partnership and the scale of funding, is in marked contrast to many of the largely unfunded and often over-bureaucratised projects that have occurred since the 1990s. Mahi Ka Ora has provided a safe way to navigate the differences between Te Ao Māori and the world of government with its own processes and culture. The Whai Kāinga, Whai Oranga funding facilitates local initiatives, capacity building, and cultural self-determination. It contrasts with Progressive Home Ownership Fund, so this is my view, which was developed as a more generic model where the rules are set centrally without the same attention paid to cultural values and local variations. The flexibility of the scheme is different, and the sense of agency is not encouraged in the same way. There is more bureaucracy and less encouragement to scale up and grow capacity. In fact, in the Whai Kāinga, Whai Oranga, there's one Taranaki group that's using PHO funding within that fund, and they're going to build they've committed to 31 houses, which was just about as many Māori houses as been built, 33, in the whole time that the PHOs has been going. Now, I'm not knocking PHO. Please don't hear me say that. We need that. But it needs to get much greater ambition and to be ramped up. The Whai Kāinga, Whai Oranga investment in Māori housing is to scale. It is large. It is historic, and it will make a difference to Māori housing and wellbeing. It is the first time, though, since the 1980s, that this sort of urgency and realism has occurred in New Zealand housing policy. Investment at this sort of scale will be needed to continue for more than a decade if the goal to reduce the current inequities and housing stress are to be achieved. Now, I heard Andrew Crisp say today, and he said this to me personally, is that this is a breakthrough in terms of Māori, but it's also opening up other ways for the rest of the population. As is often said, what's good for Māori is often good for the rest of the community. So, I want to finish with 2 slides trying to pull all this together that I've said. The good news is that Budget 2023 delivered another, just last week, delivered another 200 million to Whai Kāinga, Whai Oranga, to the Kai Oranga Fund. The bad news is there was no money set aside in that budget for Pacific housing, and we must advocate for that. That is critical. The sobering news, and Kay talked about sobering news in her one. I'm not holding her responsible for what I'm about to say now, but this is what I think is the sobering news that she was referring to. The annual investment is still way below the 1960 to 86 period. It's a fantastic investment, but please let's not think this is where it should stop. It's still below what was happening annually at that point. Māori investment has become established. Māori investment has to become established annually and eventually close the home ownership gap with the rest of New Zealand. Government needs to respond to the Pacific community and enter into a culturally safe partnership with them on their terms. Large investment will have to move into the cities as well as the rural areas. So kai whaianga, kaianga whai oranga is largely in rural areas at the moment, and that's appropriate. But in time, it will have to move into the cities. And we need a new way of thinking that needs to be developed that gets beyond simply solving problems and putting a roof over people's heads and begins to incorporate the importance of equity for housing stability and intergenerational equity. So I want to finish by saying, let's think equity. So here's a whole range of questions I just want to finish off with. We need to ask, why should some people have access to the advantages of wealth and not others? We used to recognise that access to home ownership enabled household stability, long-term community and whānau connections, and an asset base that could be called upon and protected people. So this is the last slide. We could start reflecting on how the current rules of government investment in chips through IRRS has changed the game by firstly specifying the client family and secondly funding primarily rental arrangements and only rental arrangements adequately. We could begin to ask the uncomfortable question of why chips are not providing a range of tenure choices and client family types as much as they used to. They are providing some choices, but not as much as they used to. Are they simply chasing the money? We could begin, this is not going to make me popular, some of these questions. We could begin to ask why the financial incentives are so strongly weighted towards renting rather than owning when it has never provided long-term housing stability in Aotearoa. That's a question for government and for policymakers that are here. We could reflect on Rowena and Tyrone's addresses that made it uncompromisingly clear that they wanted home ownership for their people. And Hai Tū said exactly the same this morning, but I'd already printed these slides. We could reflect much more about income and wealth equality. We might like to consider how we could enable low and modest income families to have a real stake in society, not just a roof over their heads. We could start negotiating for financial incentives for rent to buy, shared equity, subsidised loans, etc., for future CHIPS development equal to and greater than the current financial incentives to rent with IRRS. In short, we could bring equity, wealth and net worth into all our conversations about housing stress as a matter of course. They are usually absent at the moment. So I know we've got a lot we congratulate ourselves on, but there are challenges that we need to be taking seriously, and we need to be going a lot further than we are at the moment. We did it for decades after World War II. It is part of our housing whakapapa. Let's be bold and take hold of it again. Many of us, dare I say most of us, take these options in our own families. Why should those in housing stress be served anything less? Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa.